wins in the workplace. So that's you're going to see a bit of that material tonight. Not all of it, but a bit of it. But that's Zach. I've enjoyed working with you, Zach.
No, thank you. I appreciate the introduction. And so Doug had mentioned we both met several years ago. As we had gotten to know each other, I had told him I'd done some research on generations, and it really fascinated him. And we both started looking at together because we felt like there just wasn't enough discussion. And then all of these stereotypes and confusion, and that actually inspired our talk, and then the book that Doug had mentioned. So with that being said, we'll go on ahead and dive deeper into this. So some of the goals we have from our session tonight. So we'll briefly start off, we'll define what a generation is, and then we'll look at each generation ranging from the silent generation up to generation alpha. Doug and I will each talk about uh, what strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities each generation brings to the workplace. And then we'll talk about where we're all going. So we're in this Industry 4.0 world as we're transitioning to Industry 5.0. What can we do to all be able to thrive, whether we're on the younger end or the older end of the generational spectrum? So to start off, you might wonder, what is a generation? And you might have heard folks talk about the term generation in a very vague sense. We hear about it a lot in Kansas City. Folks are like, hey, you have a generational quarterback, once in a generation quarterback, which after a while gets kind of annoying. But when we talk about generation is more of a technical term. It's a group of folks that are born roughly within the same time period, and it could be within a 20 to 40 year time span. Since the pace of change has accelerated over the past century, generational timeframes have been narrowed down to about 15 years or a little bit less. There are even micro generations. So think of generations kind of within like a 6 to 7 year window. Doug and I will not talk about them because it's hard to track changes, and then it's really confusing to follow all the different terms. And then across a generation, there are shared events and traits that shape them when they're growing up. It's almost kind of like a stamp from the time frame they grew up in. Now, you want to bear in mind, and Doug and I, we recognize it's important to discuss limitations up front, because there can be misunderstanding with looking at each generation. So the first point to recognize is that when we talk about generation, it's more than just looking at your family or a neighborhood or a city. It's looking at tens of millions of people. Um, and for our presentation tonight, I actually went in. So for each generation, we'll start off briefly looking at the legacy of the greatest generation, but I updated the estimates to reflect the number of people alive within the US from 2022. Um, and so, we're talking about tens of millions of people. And with that being said, um, all of those people could have different interactions with different generations, older and younger than them. And so there are cases where individuals might not relate to the generation they're born in, which is okay. And there are individuals that are born close to generational cutoffs. And if that happens, what Doug and I have observed is that they're kind of like a hybrid. So they have traits of both the generations they're close to. And then in no way is any of this intended to be a stereotype. Doug and I have found that some people approach this conversation in a negative light, in terms of tearing people down. Um, we think it's important to build each other up, and looking at the events and the traits that shape each generation, there is a natural tendency of strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities. Generations aren't threats to each other. It's not like millennials come along and we're like an alien invasion or whatnot. Um, but with that being said, I'll pass this off to Doug to start us off with the greatest generation.
Okay. Thank you, Zach. So greatest generation. The This is the generation that fought in World War II. It's known as the Greatest Generation or the GI generation. It was Tom Brokaw who did a book about the Greatest Generation that kind of gave it its name. Many of these people have retired now, or they've left the workplace. Some of them have passed away. But they left us a legacy. This legacy has an influence on the current and future generations. They left a very large influence on the following group, the silent generation, as they're called. They created institutions and policies that we take for granted today. They were very patriotic, they were team-oriented, and they created policies and standards that we live by today. So today it's, 500,000 to 1 million people left. They are in their 90s to 100s. Some of them are still alive. The key events that affected them, the Roaring Twenties. Okay, you probably heard about that and read about it. The Roaring Twenties was a boom period, and then there was a Great Depression that followed that. World War II, though, and the Korean War was definitely a huge impact on them. Before the Roaring Twenties, we had the Spanish flu epidemic, which, of course, we've just been through another pandemic, and we kind of hear that all the time today. But they were very self-reliant. They were committed to what they're doing. There were some weaknesses also for this generation. They lacked self-awareness. I mean, if you told them you have to, evaluate how you're thinking and how you, no, they would generally not do that. They were very change averse. They said, no, if it works, stick to it. They were also very trusting of authority. Authority was important to them, and they would follow authority, and they would do what authority wanted. Questioning authority was not something they did very much. So, next slide, Zach. Following them came the silent generation. These people were born from 1927 to 1945. They're currently in their 70s to 90s. Again, they're not a big group compared to later generations. There were about 18 million of them. There are about 18 million of them. They're mostly in retirement, but again, they have made huge contributions to our work systems. The reason they're called silent generation is there was a Time magazine article that called them that, and they generally did not stand out. They weren't a group that would want to be out in front, to be leaders. I think, Zach, how many presidents have we had from this generation?
We've only had one, our current president, Joe Biden.
One. Okay. So yeah, this generation didn't want to stand up. However, they were the power behind. They supported a great deal. The Great Depression had a massive impact on them because they were children, and whatever happens when you're a child leaves a lasting impression. World War II and the Korean War affected them also as they grew up. The Korean War in particular, a number of them were of an age where they went to Korea. The civil rights movement began and grew strongly while they were, as they were growing up, as they were entering young adulthood and entering the career. They affected our culture. They affected our upper management. Today they're on boards of directors and they're influencing the direction of large organizations. So their strengths, they were very hardworking and determined and thrifty. They were, keep your head down and work. That was kind of their thinking. They married and had families, and they were they just worked very traditionally. They weren't very good at technology. I mean, not like we think of it today. And yes, they were quiet. They didn't stand out. All right. They worked behind the scenes. Now, opportunities for them. They are very stable. They were loyal, but they were also very resourceful. They would make the best of whatever they were given. Okay, you know, being there is, just being in the right place at the right time. That's what they thought as the value. Okay, so Zach, let's go to the big group. Okay, so baby boomers. Now, I resemble this area, this category. I'm in that age range. And so the boomers came from 1946 to 1964 is when they were born. It's a large time span. Uh, their current age, they go from their 50s to their 70s. There's approximately 69 million people in this group. This is a huge group of people. Now, it's not overwhelming. And the boomers did something in America that people of that age in other countries did not do. See, the boomers had kids. And so the US today has the benefit of a relatively stable population, demographic profile. Other countries are not in that boat, you know. So this is going to help the US in the future tremendously. It's amazing how this could how long these things last. Um, they, they're working as experts and in management, and they have specific expertise that they're applying. The key events for the boomers: the post-World War II economic boom, which fueled a tremendous sense of opportunity, and the future will be better than today. That's kind of a boomer mantra. Okay, the Vietnam War and the Cold War were what happened for them. Now, understand that these wars didn't dramatically impact society the way World War II did, but they did affect the outlook on things. Um, and yes, the space race. This was started in the early 60s, and they saw this race play out with, U.S. putting the first man on the moon. That's true. It's been 50 years since we put a man on the moon, but we still have pretty solid, outer space program today. Some of the traits of this group, their strengths were commitment, being a team player, and being a mentor, helping people younger than themselves. Some of their weaknesses, though, they prefer a structure. They work best when there's a structure and a framework that they can work within. Another weakness is the boomers are pretty competitive, and competition is fine, but we also need to collaborate, and that's maybe where they were a little weaker. Technology is not generally a strength amongst the boomers. Now, there are exceptions, but as a group, many of the boomers do have trouble with this modern technology. um, the opportunities the boomers bring, they are positive in the look at the future. They provide positive reinforcement for things can get done. They're very hands-on. They like to work with their hands and work on things and be part of stuff, and they're task-oriented. So again, this is the boomers. Okay, so Zach,
Okay. Oh, you want to do Generation X, or you want me to?
I'll do this one. I'll do this one. So you got a lot of other things you're going to talk about.
Don't worry. If you're in Gen X, we didn't forget about you.
No, we did. Gen X. Some people think, well, they're the forgotten generation. Not really. The Gen X had a big impact. They were born between 65 and 1980. They're currently in their 40s to 50s. There's about 66 million of this group. They are in mid-career. They're directors or they're experts. They were often called latchkey kids. You see, their generation was the first to have so many dual income families where the mom and dad both worked. And so the kids would come home from school and they would let themselves into the house or apartment. And so they had a latchkey and they would take care of themselves. Okay. This produced some of their traits. Because the baby boomers stayed longer in the workplace, Generation X was held back from being promoted at a younger age. They frequently needed to kind of wait on the boomers to leave the workplace. Generation X has some more recent leaders who are now coming into positions of authority. Some of the key events that happened to them. Economic instability became quite common in this time period. There were a lot of layoffs, a lot of uh, a lot of people lost work, and they some of them were insulated from that by the dual income, right? Because one parent would lose their job and the other parent could take over. But still, that was a factor in their lives. The boomers did not see this. They saw the end of the Cold War and they saw the Gulf War. Again, these were, significant events. They saw the rise of the personal computer. This is possibly the most amazing shift that we have had in our society since they invented the telephone or the automobile. You see the picture in the upper right, okay? You see that there's a laptop computer there, right? But what's that other thing with the black keys? I mean, with the white paper sticking out of it. That's a typewriter. So Generation X learned to type on typewriters, and then they switched to computers. So they saw that switch. Some of the strengths of Generation X, they're hard workers. They work very hard, and they will often work well unsupervised. As latchkey kids, they learned how to do that. They're good at prioritization. They're good at, well, we're going to start with this, and then we're going to do that, and then we're going to do that. They learn how to prioritize. They also learn to have respect. Respect for other people is a strength of theirs. Now, there are some weaknesses, like every generation has weaknesses, okay? They tend to be a little bit more passive. They do value efficiency. And is that a weakness? Well, yeah, I suppose. If what you're seeking is excellence, sometimes efficiency and excellence don't go hand in hand. They also have not made the money because they've been held back in their careers. And so not having a lot of money meant that they could not consume and they could not have as many children. So this is an economic impact on all of us. The opportunities that they bring to the workplace, they're reliable, they're consistent, they do value feedback. Tell me how things are going. So with that, I turn this over to Zach now, millennials.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Doug. So, um, the way we structured this, so I have Doug start off with the older generations, and now we get into the younger ones. So if you haven't met millennials before, hi, it's nice to meet you. We do exist. There are a lot of us. The term millennial, so for this generation, they were born between the early 1980s to about the mid 1990s. Um, the term millennial means being born close to the millennium, so the dawn of the 21st century. And there's some other nicknames they have as well. So demographers not being very creative after Generation X, you get Generation Y. They're also known as the trophy generation because there was a shift in parenting philosophy that happened after the 1980s. So prior to the 1980s, the prevailing philosophy was parents are to be respected, almost viewed more like a hierarchy. There was this common saying that kids were to be seen and not heard. Um, well, after the 1980s, it was almost like a 180 flip where suddenly you saw some parents that wanted to be their child's friend and kind of have a more active role. And as Doug had mentioned with the baby boomer generation, for the most part, being the parents of millennials, with them having more money, they could be more hands-on and engaged with their kids. Um, and for a lot of millennials, they participate in sports teams. And when they were kids, what they would see is that everyone would get a trophy, whether they had won or not in their sports. That's where a trophy generation comes from. They're also known as the echo boomers. So if you think about it, you have the baby boomer generation, they're really large. You've got Generation X, which is kind of like the middle child, a little bit smaller, and then you've got millennials that are, another larger generation. And so currently, they're in their upper 20s to just about early 40s. The oldest millennial might be about 43 or so this year, and there's about 63 million of them. If we adjust the time frame, it might increase that number a little bit, maybe to 70 million or so. Um, and some of the key events that influenced millennials while they were growing up, in terms of the economy, they saw a dual-edged sword. On one hand, they lived through the 1980s, 1990s, through most of the 2000s. There was a lot of prosperity, a lot of innovation with the internet that occurred. But then on the flip side, organizations were changing how they operated. So for the greatest generation, for the silent generation, and for probably the older part of the baby boomer generation, they grew up, for their experience, they would get one job for 30 or 40 years, then they retire and have a pension, and their employer would look after them. Well, with Generation X and then with millennials, we saw this erosion between the employee and the employer relationship, and companies would publicize their layoffs that they did. And so, millennials as kids, some of them saw their parents get laid off or penalized for being loyal to organizations for decades. A lot of millennials, they also remember when 9/11 happened, so the terrorist attacks on September 11th, 2001, and then the U.S. getting involved in the Middle East for a long time. And then this is the first generation. They've never known a time without the internet. And so they have mobile devices, video games. It's really common to see folks in this generation playing on their phone, or trying to talk to you while they're playing on their phone. And again, it's not their fault. They're not trying to be rude. It's just what they're used to. So, since millennials are in early career or just getting into mid-career, um, Doug and I feel it's important to go a little more in depth into what they bring to the workplace. So, if we look at their strengths, from a young age, they can articulate their own ideas, they can do research online, so they're really good at independent thinking, and problem solving to some extent. And this next part I'm about to say is kind of corny. And if you're a parent, you might have had this experience with your kids. So for millennials, and again, I think this is some of the legacy of the baby boomer optimism. Their parents told them you can make a difference in the world. Now, what their parents didn't realize is that their kids actually believed them. And so when they got to be older, some millennials went on to start nonprofits, get engaged in government, but then also bring that to companies and ask companies, hey, what are we doing to help the community? How are we giving back? And that's where this idea of corporate social responsibility emerged. So they have a strong sense of social responsibility of being involved in the community, and they're also very flexible. Since they've spent so much time on the internet and online, it's changed how they perceive work. So prior to millennials, so Gen X and prior, for most places, you go into an office or a store, you work your shift, you come home, there's that work-life separation that occurs. With millennials, it's work-life integration. So they could be working at home, they could go walk their dog, they might be on a Zoom meeting with colleagues, then they come back and do some work, they take a break, they do more work, they stay up into the night. Um, so there's this idea that work isn't just tied to a certain time or location with millennials. Now there are some weaknesses. So one of them is work ethic. And this has kind of been echoed from some of the older generations. And the reason why I have this listed here is with the internet, it made it easier to get information and find answers to stuff. And it made it where they didn't have to work as hard compared to prior generations. So sometimes putting in the work for stuff can be a little challenging. I think as they've gotten older, this has gotten better. Loyalty is another one. Um, I'd heard a couple of years ago that if you can keep a millennial for 18 months, it's a miracle. So I tell people I've had my company for 4 years. I haven't quit, so I must be doing something to retain myself. Of course, if I quit, I'd have 100% turnover, or maybe 50%, because my dog does some work too. He's good at barking and stuff. But since millennials have grown up seeing their parents, the older generations get penalized for loyalty, they're very skeptical and distrustful of organizations and also organizational leaders. And then patience is another weakness. So having all this technology, quick access to information, they tend to not wait as long for getting what they need or information. Now, some of those did sound kind of bad. Again, I think as they've gotten older, those weaknesses have gotten better. But there are a lot of opportunities that they bring to the workplace. They're really good with technology, have really good technical skills. Since they've had access to all this information online, they can be very creative. They can bring new ideas to the table or new perspectives, especially international perspectives. So being able to engage with other folks from outside the US. And then they really enjoy learning or professional development, which is why I think ASQ is a great example of an organization they could be involved in. So any kind of training, going to conferences, certifications, this generation, they love that kind of stuff. And then we get to Generation Z. So again, demographers not being very creative. You've got Gen X, Y, and Z. They're also known as the I generation. So again, the second generation to grow up, never knowing a time without the internet. And I've actually read recently that this is going to be the last generation that grows up without AI tools like ChatGPT from a young age. The time frame they're born in, so pretty much the late 1990s up to about 2009 or the early 2010s. So currently on the older end of this generation, they're in their mid or just getting into upper 20s. Still early career, might have just graduated college, figuring out what to do. On the younger end, they're finishing up K-12, so might be in high school or college. And there's a lot of them. And as Doug had mentioned, so going back a little bit, after World War II, a lot of the world and Europe was devastated from chaos. And with the US, we were lucky. We had the greatest generation. We had the boomers that were large generations. And millennials and Generation Z, they're relatively large as well. In other countries, their millennial and Generation Z cohorts are smaller. Now, some of the key events that have influenced Generation Z in the US, so economic instability. So again, another generation growing up, seeing their parents get penalized for loyalty, for putting all this work into places. To kind of give you a snapshot of what Generation Z looks like growing up. So imagine they're um, really little kids when 9/11 happens. When they go to elementary school, they hear about gun violence. When they go to middle school and high school, the 2008 and 9 recession happens. They go to graduate college, COVID-19 pandemic occurs, and then even more change and disruption. They've also witnessed the proliferation of e-commerce, so doing economic activity online and the internet. COVID-19's had a huge effect on their early career plans or college plans, and then technological innovation. Um, Also with this generation, so one other point to mention is they've grown up from a young age hearing about climate change, that in the future the planet might not exist. And so we've seen young people be very vocal about older generations doing stuff to protect our environment because they're concerned when they're older, the world might not exist the way it is today. So since Generation Z is on the cusp of entering the workforce or their early career, this is another generation that Doug and I felt we should go a little more in depth on. Some of the strengths they bring to the workplace, they're very adaptable. So growing up with all this change and disruption, they're used to making pivots or being agile. They're very diverse. They're the most diverse generation we've had in U.S. history. I think I read about a quarter of them are Hispanic, and they bring a lot of diversity of thought to organizations. They're also really good at multitasking. So, they could be on their email, they could jump on a phone call, they could jump on a call like this, do all of that again. They're really good at switching between tasks. Now, some of the weaknesses they have, they tend not to be as good in front of large groups. They're really good in front of smaller groups. Sometimes when you give them feedback, they can take it personally. And then, since there's all this technology that's always grabbing their attention, they can get distracted very easily. So when you're working with them, you can break work up into smaller pieces or sprints. That's a little bit easier for them. Now, there are a lot of opportunities they bring to the workplace. So similar to millennials, they're really good with technology. They have a lot of technical skills. There's actually companies that have been hiring TikTok interns because some of them are so used to apps like that to help their companies get adjusted to them. Um, they tend to be more pragmatic than millennials, so they bring a realistic perspective to stuff. And then they're willing to put in the work, and a lot of them want to be entrepreneurs or business owners. Or again, some of them get involved in nonprofits. And then we've got Generation Alpha, which some of you might not have heard of yet. Um, so again, you've got Gen X, Y, Z, and then demographers go back to A, and you might wonder why did they do that? The reason why is because for Generation Alpha, they're the first generation that's entirely born after the year 2000. Um, as you can see from the time frame, they have about another year or two worth of folks being born, so they're just about done being born for the most part. So currently, the youngest Gen Alpha today, they would have just been born. On the older end, they might just be completing elementary school or middle school. This would actually be Doug's grandkids. He's got a couple that fall within this generation, and they're smaller. So currently, they're estimated to be about 53 million people. They might get to be a little bit bigger, but again, a little bit smaller than your millennial and Gen Z cohorts. Um, you might notice on here that Doug and I do not have strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities listed. That's because they're still growing up. I mean, imagine if I went to you when you were 6 years old and I was like, "Hey, what do you bring to the workplace?" You might be like, "Hey, I could bring my coloring book." So, as they get older, their generational traits will emerge. But what Doug and I can say is some of the key events that are shaping them today, they've grown up through a lot of economic instability. They've probably seen some of their parents have to work at home or get disrupted from the pandemic, the emergence of the gig economy, so working at more than one place at one time, social justice reform, technological innovation, so growing up alongside AI. And odds are when they enter the workplace, there's a good chance they might be competing with AI for jobs. So the World Bank is advising countries from all over the world to address childhood malnutrition and education, so that way kids will be ready to navigate that Industry 5.0 world or AI-driven world. Ooh, okay, so Doug and I have thrown a lot at you. We've talked about a century worth of generations, starting with the greatest generation, going up to Generation Alpha. So what we found is that regardless of generations, so whether you're on the younger end or older end of the spectrum, we found that there are shared goals across all generations. So regardless of where you are, we found that folks want to be successful. They want to be good at what they do. They want to get recognized, so earn certifications, grow within their industry, or grow their skill sets if they're jumping around from different industries. And then they want to make meaningful connections and build relationships, both professionally and personally. And especially in the quality world, I think there are lots of opportunities that are overlooked for our younger generations today. They get a chance to work in a challenging, complex, constantly changing environment. There are leadership opportunities for them to grow into. Doug's seen this firsthand with his experience with the Certified Manager Quality certification. And then you can make an impact in an organization. You can add value to the bottom line, to customers and the community through working in quality or a similar field. Okay, so I've said a lot, so I'm going to pass this off to Doug. He's going to talk a little bit about motivation, but then also quality tools and how they apply to generations.
Thank you, Zach. We trade off to kind of keep our voice from going completely flat. So motivation is a challenge. It has been a challenge for every generation. How do we motivate this new generation? We've probably heard that a million times. So we all know that pay is a dissatisfier. Okay, in the words of Frederick Herzberg's 1959 motivational hygiene theory, we've heard this. Okay, in other words, low pay will dissatisfy people. High pay does not create high motivation. I think there's still a lot of people that don't quite understand that. In a more recent thinking about motivation, uh, purpose, mastery, and autonomy are a motivational framework. This comes from Daniel Pink, P-I-N-K. Perhaps you've heard of him. Pink says that these are the drivers of motivation. If you think about it in relationship to your own experiences, okay, there's a lot to this theory. These three things interconnect, and by using them, you can help to build a better work group. So when we talk about purpose, you need to know the purpose of your work, or you are unlikely to care about it. It's kind of so what? Why should I care? Well, people aren't born knowing the purpose of these jobs. You generally have to tell them. When we talk about autonomy, you need some room to make the job your own and not be micromanaged. So this is one of the ways that the younger folks can chafe against their management. You see, they need space and they need the tools to do the work. They want to create new ideas and innovate, so they have to be allowed to do that. This is very important to Generation X and millennials. And mastery. Now, mastery is where people need to have the resources to do their work well. If you're not given the resources to get your work done, you're going to be demotivated. So management has to provide materials, support, and money. Now, this has been really important to the silent generation and the baby boomers, but there's still a feeling of, boy, if I master this, I'm going to feel really good about what I'm doing. So while each generation has had slightly different values, these three categories can transcend generations if they're properly interpreted to that generation's interests. Each generation recognizes these things. For example, but see, sometimes it's a little bit more valued in one generation than others. For example, loyalty was a key for the silent generation. Generation Z, lack of hypocrisy is a key to them. Well, other generations like mine might have tolerated hypocrisy. Generation Z sees that as a, kind of a showstopper. So that's motivation. What about tools? What can we do about this? Being in quality, we all love our tools, right? The tools are useful, and we've got three of them here. Okay, affinity diagrams. I'm sure most of you have done affinity diagrams or affinity analysis. We're going to use that to talk about trust. So what you would do is when you get a group of people together, multi-generational tool, you get them to all write down their ideas, okay? And then you take all on Post-its or maybe virtual. Zach and I have done this virtually using a software package. So you put all these Post-it notes in there and everybody makes their own. And then you arrange them. Now, the way this works is you don't have preconceived categories. The ideas all bunch based on how they would group. And so you're building categories around the low level ideas. And then this ends up being a bit of a brainstorming exercise to make new groups, new categories, and populate them, these new ideas to drive innovation. But as a side effect, what happens is the group learns to trust each other. They trust each other's ideas and they see the value they bring. And so you bring trust up, but you're also accomplishing something else. Force field analysis. This is another tool, okay? So here's what you would do. You're struggling with communicating what you're going to do and what changes you're going to make, okay? And so we all know those phrases that people have come up with to stop change from happening. Think about it yourself. Have you heard people come up with phrases that are negative? On one side of a piece of paper, you draw a line down the middle, and on one side you put the negative ideas. On the other side, you're going to come up with positive opposites, but you start with the negatives, and you go down that list, and you probably heard some of them, like they never listened to us, or we tried that and it didn't work. You've heard this? Or my favorite, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. We've heard these negative phrases. And you know what those negative phrases are intended to do? They're intended to stop your thinking. Stop going there. That's what they want you to do. Here's what you do. You put all those negative ideas on one side. And then on the other side, you come up with opposites for each of those. For example, they never listen to us. Repetition is key. That's the opposite to that one. Or we tried that and it didn't work. Here's the opposite. That was then and this is now. Or if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Every method can be improved. And again, doing this is a way to kind of make sure that things don't get stopped flat. It is a way of communicating and getting through to people and getting them to listen to what's actually going on. One of the phrases might be, that'll never work. And if you know the people involved, you can kind of get a sharp edge on your reply. You could say, so did you ride a horse into work today? The point is you're trying to get through to them that change is possible, that it can work. This is a way to address negativity. Now, the final tool is about stories. Now, you might think, well, that's not a tool. Well, listen, all of us learned what the world is by listening to stories. That's how all humans have always taught their children. They tell them stories, and the stories tell children how the world works. And so how do you change people's mental map? You tell them a story. And so this telling stories works because our brains are built for stories. As a matter of fact, what Zach and I are doing right now, we are telling you a story. And this story is changing your mental map as we go. So it's an important piece that you can bring people together. The technology can get in the way, or it can help. Look how this technology is helping us tell you a story. What we're trying to do is to change the worldview so that you can see reality. You can see what's really going on. One important aspect of seeing reality is a phrase that I teach to anybody. I teach problem solving all the time. And one of the phrases I teach everybody is this. The phrase, I think I know, but I could be wrong. That is a foundational phrase for critical thinking, for really seeing what's going on. Because you see, if you think you know what's going on, you won't see anything except what you think is happening. That is also built into us. We see what we want to see, we hear what we want to hear. But if you tell yourself, I think I know, but I could be wrong, now you start to see and you understand much more. So we all go through phases through our life. But when we get born, when we're born, that gives us an environment we grew up with. Every generation needs to work with other generations to overcome these weaknesses. So again, these are techniques we can use to connect both old and young. Zach?
Okay. Doug, actually, you got to kick this one off about the old. So this is
Yeah.
looking at lessons learned. So Doug will start off with what the older generation should be mindful of when working with younger generations.
Very good. Yep. So, our silent gen, baby boomers, Generation X, they need to remain open minded. They need to put value on a new idea, to not discard a new idea just because it's a new one. They also have to understand that sustainability means recruiting and retaining younger associates. I mean, if you don't hang on to people and they turn over every month, everything is going to collapse. So you need to think of sustainability not from the standpoint of, ecological damage or, maintaining. No, you also have to be sustainable in your knowledge base, and that means sustainable in terms of retaining people. You also have to be available to mentor people when it's time. And then give them some space to let them figure out the rest of it on their own. And so that's the lessons we think older generations need. Zach, what about the younger ones?
Well, in terms of younger folks working with the older generations, it's important for them to listen to what the older generations have to say, especially today. We might not realize it, but um, there's this huge transition going on between the baby boomer generation and Generation X, Y, and Z. And now more than ever, we need that tacit knowledge or that knowledge transfer to go on from the boomers, so that way the generations after them could be successful. And when looking at older generations, it's important for younger folks to recognize what they bring to the table. Doug, for example, he's got decades of experience in quality root cause analysis. Younger folks have got to see that almost like they're treasure hunting. Like, you found, like a pot of gold. Because older folks have that, and they're often willing to work with younger folks as long as they'll listen, but then also be respectful and be mindful of the older generation's input, because they might have put in, other systems or whatnot in the past. Um, just as older generations have put in the work to become experts and good at what they do, younger generations have to do the same. And it's more than just going on YouTube, reading an article online, um, taking a course. It's really about putting in the work. Now, having older folks as mentors can help you. They can help save some time, but you still have to put in the work. And then look for opportunities to collaborate. For younger folks, merge their energy, their innovation, their new perspectives with the experience that older folks have. And by doing that, you unlock infinite possibilities for our organizations, but also our communities. And so, with that being said, there's a lot coming in the near future. So, some emerging trends they'll be affecting all of us. Augmented virtual reality. I think more from a quality perspective, big data, getting involved with data governance, data quality. For a lot of the students I see, they're going to the quality world. They ask a lot about data science. Um, we've all seen the disruption with AI and machine learning that's gone on with Chat GPT, Gemini, some of these other tools. It's only going to accelerate faster as time goes on. And so as we look at all these trends coming, along. And I think one other one I should note too that's specific to quality is the reshoring that's happening in the U.S. That we're seeing a lot of supply chains and domestic manufacturing come back from outside the U.S. Um, it's important to look, and as Doug had mentioned, sustainability, is looking at recruiting and retaining associates, not only for younger folks, also for older generations. So your silent generation, your baby boomers, your Gen X, they're healthier compared to the generations prior at their various ages. And especially for older folks, they can still contribute to just as much as younger folks can. But then also looking at what the marketplace will look like. So, for organizations today would be a risk not to start thinking about Generation Alpha, but then also how are we serving that multi-generational customer base? So connecting with our older and our younger associates or customers. And then here's some resources that we use to put this presentation together. We're happy to provide a PDF copy. If you're interested, you could email us after the presentation. And then some takeaways. So we started off, we talked about what a generation is. We looked at the legacy that the greatest generation left, and then we looked at each generation, the silent generation, baby boomers, Generation X, Y, and Z. And it's hard to believe. We have 5 different generations in the workplace, and we might have 6 pretty soon. We might add Generation Alpha to the mix as well. We looked at generational strengths in the workplace, weaknesses, opportunities. Doug shared some information on motivation, and then quality tools that we could use to connect people. And then Doug and we both talked about lessons that older and younger generations can learn from each other, and then shared some thoughts on where we're all going in the future. Ultimately, I think that we can get there together. I think regardless of generation, if you put the work into it, if you go out there, you try to connect with folks, this is going to have to be an effort that we all do together. I had someone at a conference tell me, imagine the world today. This is the slowest that the world will ever change compared to tomorrow or the future. And as we move toward Industry 5.0, it's critical that we're all able to work together and recognize that quality is more than just a technical or manufacturing aspect. There's also quality culture that's also important as well. And then here's our contact information. I do want to thank all of you for attending tonight or watching this video. Doug and I hope that you got some value out of it, and that you had some fun along the way as well. I do want to thank Doug. It's been really fun working with him. As I mentioned, he's got decades of experience in quality. Some areas that I'm not familiar with. Highly recommend you connect with him. It's been incredible. He's trained a generation of quality professionals. He helped create a world-class webinar program with the quality management division. And he's been a fun colleague to get to work with.
And I have appreciated working with Zach. Honestly, the two of us are an example of different generations collaborating and working together. I guess perhaps we should open it for questions now. Maybe,
Does
maybe
anyone?
I don't have a question, but I want to thank you to give us this perspective from the different generations, that we need to consider if we want to succeed. Okay, because sometimes we have our own philosophy and we think that that's going to be, successful everywhere. And based on what you said about the generation, it's not possible to throw the ball exactly the same way. So thank you. It was excellent presentation, Zach and Doug. Thank you.
you're welcome.
I guess as I listen to this, as you talk about generational perspectives, right? I mean, every generation, of course, within it has its, let's say, personalities, right? So how do you propose like overlaying that. Like, again, the folks who've grown up now, like I think about my own children, that they have been immersed in access to information in a way that, when I was growing up, if I wanted information, if I needed to get reference information, pretty much have to go to the library, right? And, now if they have a question, I'm like, use that magic device you're carrying around in your pocket, you know. So, there are certainly those generational differences, but then in the way that the synthesis happens, when it comes to like the personalities, I'm kind of curious how you guys are, look at that. How do you fold that into your analysis?
Can I answer this, Zach?
Yeah, you go first, and then I'll go.
And then you'll go. Okay. So while the access to information is different, okay, there still needs to be a consideration and a critical eye to looking at that information. When we used to go to the library and we'd look it up in a book, we'd read it, we'd read this, we'd read that, we'd look at different versions, and we'd try to say, well, these guys can all be right. Today, you can get instant information, but it's channeled, and you oftentimes get just a narrow perspective on things. It's important to look at these different sources and apply critical thinking. And I believe that's one of the things that us older people can do, is we can provide the critical questions. What questions should you ask about this information to see if it's reliable? Zach, what do you think?
Well, I think to speak to the personality point, I feel like collectively in our culture, as we've gone through over the last several decades, so there's this book called Bowling Alone that looked at decline in community engagement and going to like bowling alleys or community events. We've seen a decline in associations, and collectively, if all of us are working more and we're spending less time together getting to know each other, I think that widens some of those different generational gaps. And so taking the time, if you're like a late career colleague, getting to know younger folks, engaging in mentoring, even doing reverse mentoring, but doing what you can to surround yourself with a diverse range of associates. They're older and younger. I think that can help bridge some of those generational gaps, because I think sometimes we get stuck within perhaps just our viewpoint, and we miss out on other ideas or perspectives. And Forbes actually did a study. They found that organizations that have greater diversity of thought and generational makeup, that they actually outperform their competitors.
Gentlemen, this is Sergio. First of all, again, I want to echo what Orfil said. A great presentation. I really, really enjoyed it a lot. Thank you so much. And it is a pleasure meeting both of you. I really love the interaction between you guys. And it was a perfect example of the presentation that you had. So I commend you for that. Thank you so much for that. I did make a couple of notes, if it's worth noting, for one of the things that for the presentation, one of the things that I think was a key event also for the greatest generation was the prohibition era. The end of the prohibition. That I think that was a huge key event in that generation. That a lot of the people cannot relate in the middle, but the younger generation can, because they're going to transformation where we're legalizing some of these some drugs, right? That. And it's going to be a key event later on for something similar to what we're doing here, and that leads me to my question. I'm pretty sure when prohibition was lifted, there was a lot of consequences or events that happened in the workforce. I'm pretty sure. Why? Because I'm pretty sure people were still, getting drunk. They were having their fun, stuff like that. Even though they were doing it on the side, it wasn't as wide open, so it wasn't readily available for everybody. But once it did, it changed a lot. I'm pretty sure. And I wanted to know what are your thoughts about the same thing's going to happen with legalizing drugs. When I was working for Dish Network, which is corporate in Colorado, one of the biggest questions that we had all the time is, okay, you just legalize marijuana, what's going to happen with these forklift drivers, when they start having an accident,
Yeah. Yeah.
is it going to be handled differently now? And you probably read about, there was a case in Texas, I think, I'm not sure if I got the right state, about a teacher being, I don't know if suspended or fired from the job, just because they were doing drugs in another state. Yet when he or she was tested in the state where they currently work, they failed, and therefore, or I don't remember if they were fired or reprimanded about it. But what are your thoughts about that? I would really like to know your thoughts about that.
Okay. Zach, you want me to start?
Yeah, you go on ahead and start on this one.
The way I look at this, prohibition, the major effect of prohibition was to create the mafia. Okay. It created corruption in our government. It created organized crime. Now, when prohibition ended, organized crime had to shift to something else because they couldn't make money at it anymore. Illegal drugs in the United States has made terrible impacts in Mexico. It has created corruption and crime in Mexico. And again, as an American, I'm very sorry about that. But that is a side effect. Okay? That wasn't the intended effect. If we legalize these drugs, what's going to happen is you're going to take the funding away from corrupt individuals. This is a net positive to our society. And yes, we're going to have to figure out how to test people for THC. Like we did, we learned how to test for alcohol. But that's a technology fix. Zach, what do you think?
Well, so looking back at prohibition, we actually mention it in the book a little bit. I think with each generation, they struggle with vices to some extent. I think what was different about that time period is that, so as Doug had mentioned, for the greatest generation, self-awareness was a weakness. Their idea of mental health and, treating addiction was way different, in some ways non-existent 100 years ago compared to today. And so post-prohibition, we actually saw Alcoholics Anonymous emerge as an organization to help them. But I still think this issue of vices has continued, and I think what concerns me with Generation Z, so you mentioned the legalization of marijuana, but I think there's also other stuff. So vaping emerged as a trend. There's a documentary on Netflix about that came out, through social media, that magnified that trend, and so more people got negatively affected by it. With younger people today, there's higher rates of depression, suicide, and anxiety. And then also with Generation Z, and I'm suspicious it might be Generation Alpha, more of them feel like they're on an island. This idea of I'm by myself, I don't have any friends, and it's just heartbreaking. But I think kind of going back to your point with the government getting involved with marijuana, I think it's they can set regulatory standards to make it safer, but I still think there'll be challenges, and I think that's also where quality professionals could come in to help. So hopefully that answered your question.
Thank you very much for your thoughts. I really appreciate it from both of you. Thank you, guys.
Well, that was a great question. Anybody else?
Jack, I like to make another question if it's possible.
Sure.
Can I?
Sure. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, Zach and Doug, you talk about sustainability several times in your presentation. in my own experience, I think, sustainability is one of the biggest challenge in order to ensure that the systems that you implement, and this could be a quality systems, is going to last, okay? And it's going to stay for many years. But you have seen that in many manufacturing environments, implementing systems and 5 years disappear. So obviously what you mentioned about the generations plays a great role, okay? And who really like it and who doesn't, in order to ensure that you're gonna have a sustainable system, okay? Obviously, any plant manager in a manufacturing facility would like to see the people from the different manufacturing areas, production, quality, maintenance, engineering, working together, okay, as an orchestra. And the major purpose is to listen, from that orchestra, the sound of success. Okay. But my question to you, you are excellent in this subject, is how generations must be handled in order to contribute to sustainability.
Sustainability.
Zach, why
Let's
don't you
see.
start?
Okay. Yeah, you just read my mind. I was about to throw that out. I would say with regards to sustainability, so the first point that comes to mind, I think in the past, organizations tended to not be very intentional about team building activities. So like for example, when Doug and I had talked, Doug had mentioned he went to an activity where they dressed up as like cowboys for a day, and that was it. They left the office. See, I'm giving Doug a heart attack, having
Oh,
him remember this.
it's a
Um,
nightmare.
and and back then it was kind of like show with the organization. It's like, hey, we're gonna do this one day activity and say we grew as a team, and then wait a whole year to do it. I think that with more work being in a virtual or hybrid environment, it's harder to have those organic connections with people. So you have to be more intentional about team building and recognize that you're constantly building teams, that it's an ongoing activity um, to sustain and build your teams. Because if there's no concept of loyalty, then you always have people coming and going, and so you're always forming, going through that storming, norming, and performing stage at a more frequent pace. I think the other part, and this might be kind of an unconventional way to look at your question, when I look at problems, I kind of go back to my thinking in political science. So trying to look at things from an individual point of view, so thinking about individual leaders or perhaps champions within an initiative, looking at institutions, so it might be departments within an organization, but then also the system as a whole. And so I found from those three frames, it gives you different viewpoints and then options to consider. I think the third part I'd add is just making sure you're inclusive with your stakeholder group. And I think for a lot of manufacturing places, they're trying to implement these, cloud-based systems or do a digital transformation. Engaging your younger folks, they're more tech savvy, and they can also help with doing testing to find bugs or issues with it. Doug, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think part of our issue today is the virtuality of work. Oftentimes people are working from home. Even if they come into the office 2 days a week, 3 days a week, they're still working from home a lot of the time. And what we've lost is the informal conversations, where people chat about non-work related things. We
Right.
all know what that, you go to lunch and you talk about stuff. Well, when you're not in the same place, you're not working together. And I think that what we need virtual events that are not work related. We need virtual events that are just to get together and talk. And the company needs to arrange those things and pay for those things because they used to. They paid for that kind of thing. And break areas. Remember when they had break areas and you have a 15-minute break in the morning and you'd go and sit down and people play cards and stuff like that? We don't have that anymore. There needs to be that piece. My son put it to me this way. He said, people work for three things. They work for money because they have to eat and sleep. They want a roof over their head. They work because they like the work itself. It's intrinsically rewarding to them. So we need to make sure they have challenges, and we need to make sure that we use those motivational pieces. But the third thing that brings people to work is the people they work with. They like the people. Well, how can you like people when the only thing you do is get together and talk work? Okay, you won't like them. So I think what's missing in a lot of workplaces is this informal gathering kind of thing, and to do it during the workday. As we see, the millennials, they'll take a break in the middle of the day. It's okay, all right. And I think we need to encourage that kind of activity to make sure. Now, for example, Zach's business, what he does, he can run a team event virtually for your company, and people get into these games, and they each have a little avatar, and they walk around and they work together, even though they're 1,000 miles apart. And they talk because there's audio, and they discuss, well, what are we going to do here? We're going to do this, we're going to do that. But it's not work related. They're just essentially playing, but they get to know each other.
And it doesn't have to be long, like a half day.
Oh, yeah.
One other point I'll add to what Doug was saying, if you have just one friend at work, you're more likely to stay. So that's why building those relationships is important.
Yeah, that's true.
Wow. Well, thank you for the excellent advice. I agree.
Good.
Yep.
I had
You're welcome.
another question, because you're actually talking to a group where almost all of us are either immigrant or we work internationally. Like most of my work was in Mexico. I mean, I can see from the list there's a number of people here who are working in Mexico, living in the United States, immigrated from Mexico. So the thought here is, you've talked about the generational communication, but I'm thinking, I also, in working, having worked for a multinational company and having to deal with people all over the world, I'm actually wondering, like, what is the bigger challenge? Is it, intergenerational, if you're raised American is one thing, but if you're an American interacting, say, with Mexicans, interacting with, say, Germans, interacting with Chinese and so forth. I mean, there's that is a, at least in large companies, is not an uncommon experience. And now with social media, it's even common socially. How do you perceive that in the context of the intergenerational communication?
Let's see. Doug, you want me to take that first?
Yeah, you take that one.
So, for hundreds of years, across the world, we've been, getting more, I guess I'd say, globalization has been a trend. So connecting different places, doing trade, the sharing of ideas. And Doug and I had found, so one of the legacies the greatest generation left was this idea that the U.S. needs to be involved internationally, that we're not just an island nation, that we need to be involved with different countries and be involved in the world. And we've seen each generation since then sustain that. I think what's interesting is that, so for instance, if you look at Generation X, one of the lessons Doug and I found from them is that they recognize it's important to have a network so people outside of a company, but
Mhm.
then also to know folks from other countries. And I think we see that continue with the millennials and Generation Z. And what's interesting about them is that from a young age, through online gaming, through interacting on the internet, they've already interacted with folks from all over the world, and that's what they're used to. And I think especially Generation Z, they bring a very valuable international perspective to organizations. And for Generation Alpha, odds are, so currently today we're dealing with workforce shortages, which will get worse, I think, in the future, as the boomers leave the workplace and retire. But with more companies going remote or toward hybrid workers, Generation Alpha might be the first generation to be working alongside international teams as kind of a more common occurrence. So you'd have like the Alpha be in the US, you'd have one in Mexico, you'd have one in Europe, you'd have them from all over the place working together. So Doug, do you want to jump in, share your thoughts?
Yeah, yeah. So I think for the Generation Z and Alpha, what we're seeing is the world is where they live. They identify less with their community and their locality and their country, and they identify more with the whole world. Okay. I think that's kind of natural to them. Um, in a way, we're doing much better because of language becoming a little more standardized. English is such a common language now that you can go almost anywhere and find people that speak English. And so that helps with the communication aspect. We have not focused on generational shifts in other countries because Zach and I don't have the experience to really go out and say that. But we have looked at these differences, and I think the tools that we talked about here, okay, I think the tools are universal. Affinity analysis, telling stories, this, the force field analysis, and other tools. You see, those work no matter what country you're from, and they work to get people together and to see things. What's needed is recognizing that indeed there are differences, acknowledging the fact that some cultural differences might get in the way. Okay. When I teach, I will talk about some cultural issues in quality. I mean, every country has cultural challenges in quality. I don't care where you're from. You're from Japan, there are issues. If you're from China, there are issues. If you're from India, there are issues. If you're from Mexico, there are issues. In America, we have our own cultural problem with quality. Tell me, have you ever met somebody that goes, well, I can do anything. Just give it to me and I can get her done. I'm an expert at everything I try to do. You know anybody like that? I call that the cowboy mentality.
Well, and see, Doug, just to add in real quick, you'd mentioned the weaknesses that each country has, but there are also opportunities. So by bringing
Right.
them all together, you get the best ideas out of that, and then you build
Mhm.
something better than if they had just done it by themselves.
And they can see each other's challenges and they can counteract those things. Again, but it needs to be done with respect. You cannot disrespect other people. You need to work with them and come from the standpoint of, hey, we're going to find a solution to this. We're going to work together to do that. So I think that's my thought on building sustainability internationally. It's here to stay. It's not going away.
Yep.
Any other questions?
Yeah, we're pushing an hour and a half on the presentation and the question and answer.
Keith, if you don't mind, I think I saw a question about ASQ and Generation Z in the chat. Do you mind if Doug and I take a stab at that real quick?
Oh, I didn't see it, but
Okay.
yeah, go for it.
Okay. So I know that ASQ currently has Generation Z members. I think it's going to grow. Um, as I mentioned earlier, millennials love these learning opportunities, getting certifications. I think Generation Z is the same. And I think some of it too is that we have to change how we look at quality. I think that we struggle to um, differentiate from manufacturing. So showing that quality is more than just manufacturing. It's important in services. It's important in education and technology and all these different places. And I think showing them the networking and then being able to connect, but then also making it fun. I think that's how you draw them in, and I think that's critical because as you have the baby boomer generation retire and soon Generation X, I mean, honestly, for a person like myself that's a younger millennial, um, I look around at the World Conference and I'm like, well, gee, who's going to be left? Like, it's just going to be me.
Yeah, that's true.
Doug, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, we've talked about how generational shifts can change the way people can interact, and one example of that was World Conference on Quality last year was in Philadelphia, and Zach and I made a suggestion to replace the hospitality suites. If any of you have been to the World Conference in the past, you know what a hospitality suite was, right? This is where different groups they'd get some alcohol and snacks, and you'd go around the hotel and you'd go from room to room, these big suites, and you'd have a drink with buddies and you chat and you get to know people. It was a lot of fun, but that doesn't happen anymore. A lot of reasons. One of them is liability. Another one is it's expensive. And the third one is that the divisions and other groups don't have the money. They're just, ASQ doesn't have the money anymore to do that. Well, that was a social event. Young people don't drink, but very few of them drink. So, what would replace that social event? And I think the answer is games. I think for young people, they enjoy games. And Zach and I suggested to hold a game night at the World Conference. Unfortunately, some of the older people at ASQ couldn't see that as a value-added activity.
But I should jump in. Despite that, we still had a game night. I brought my Minion Uno cards.
Uno
We
cards.
played. So Doug mentioned the younger folks can have fun with games. Well, I'll tell you what, the older folks did too. I think Doug won one of the rounds, and
Oh yeah, it was.
I would so they have a night where you can get drink tickets and stuff, and I'm sitting there with my Minion Uno cards, and even the ASQ staff came by. They were like, "Gee, I wish I could play with you too." So again, it goes to show you bring games,
Mhm.
board games, card games, they can bring people together, but then you reduce some of that liability from
And,
other
and you get to
folks.
know people. It is a social event, so you don't have to have official sanction. See that's what we saw was we just sat at a table in the hotel bar and we played card games. Okay.
Yes, and we will be at the World Conference again. I mentioned earlier we're doing a workshop on AI, so if you're there, we'd love to meet you and play cards. Keith, are there any other questions at all?
Not that I
Not from me.
see. So,
Jack
Cool.
and Doug, this is Jack. I really appreciate your discussion today. It was superb. Brought forth a number of memories from my past. I know that you classify me as a part of the silent generation, but let me assure you, for instance, my last 2 decades of working at the university, I was the squeaky wheel. That when I found something that wasn't working right, and I found some way to make something happen, and I felt it was my job to bring forward those things. And it you know, I've had computers in the house since the early 70s. 71 to 73, I had an IBM Selectric terminal that I hooked up with an acoustic modem to the Navy Postgraduate School 36067 every afternoon at noon.
Mm-hmm.
My classmates knew that I was the class nerd or techie, and when they called my house, I had blocked uh, call waiting because it interfered with my data exchange.
Mm-hmm.
And if they got a busy tone at my house, that meant that I was busy on the computer. They needed to call the computer operator at the university and ask them to send a message to G2498 asking me to, at my convenience, give them a call.
You know, Jack, that's an example of what we were saying. We have these generational cohorts, but there's individuals within them who
Oh yeah.
switch. They're not necessarily part of that group.
Well,
So
and there's also folks that you know, could give insight into the next generation. So you know, Martin Luther King, he was in the silent generation.
Oh yeah.
You know, there were a lot of political leaders that were well-known senators, vice presidents, business leaders like Warren Buffett. Um, so it goes to show you there can be vocal folks within a generation,
mhm.
but that's great that you were able to advocate for positive change. And I think it shows, regardless of generation, you know, you can be that advocate. And I think for younger people today with the internet, and I think older folks too, that gives them an outlet to reach a much bigger audience. So awesome. Well, Keith, are there any other questions? I know we've gone way over on time, and we've had great discussion, but I do want to be respectful of everyone's time tonight.
I don't see anything in the chat with regard to questions, but I've really
It was
enjoyed
well worth
this.
it, guys. It was
Thank you.
well worth
Thank
it.
you very much. Thank you very
I
much.
appreciate it. Thank
Awesome.
you
And
so
if you have
much.
more questions, you're welcome to reach out to us. We have our contact information here. We're happy to send you a copy of the slides. And again, want to thank all of you. This has been